Thank you guys for joining us tonight. I'm so excited to talk about all of these things. I'm going to share my screen. One sec. Okay. Michelle, is that working? That's
Looks
okay,
good.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about winter holiday pet safety. And I've broken it down into four main categories. The first thing we're going to talk about is travel safety. Obviously, this year things are looking a little bit different, but people are taking road trips locally, and eventually, obviously, we'll all hopefully be able to fly again soon. So I talked about that as well. And a big bulk of this is going to be the common holiday toxicities because now is just a really common time for pets to get into things that they shouldn't. Then we're going to talk about decor dangers, and then we're going to briefly touch on party faux pas. Okay, travel safety. So first, we're going to talk about traveling by car, which I think at this time we're probably doing a lot more often than flying. The most important thing when traveling by car to consider is to definitely get a comfortable crater carrier for your pet, especially for cats. And I can't stress that enough. Pets loose in the vehicle could definitely put them at risk for being perhaps ejected from the vehicle during even like a mild minor accident, or of course getting underfoot, putting you more at risk for an accident. I think a lot of people think loose pets in their car is very cute, but it can actually be very, very dangerous. So the carrier should be large enough for a pet to lay down, turn around, and stand up comfortably. A really great tip is to allow your pet access to the carrier prior to your trip. Don't just bust out the carrier when you're going to take a 10-hour drive. It's really great if you have that carrier perhaps out in the living room when you guys are just hanging out at home. Put some treats in there, make it a comfortable place for them so that they can actually get comfortable with it, see it. Don't think that it's new and scary. Allow them to explore the carrier. Once you buy it and bring it home, don't just immediately put it away until you need it. It's really great if they could just get more comfortable with it. Another thing also is maybe put them in the crate and walk around your house. That's also something that you can very easily do and allow them to be more comfortable just sitting in the carrier. If you're unable to crate your pet, and I think this really applies to larger dogs, really any smaller dog or cat, you should be crating in your car. You want to make sure your larger dog is secured with a pet seatbelt or an animal car seat. The seatbelt, if that's the way that you're going to go, really should be attached to a harness. Definitely don't attach it to a neck lead. There are many, many options on Amazon. I tried browsing them to see if I could pick a few, but there was like so many that I couldn't. So here's a picture. It's a great example of a car carrier that actually attaches to a seatbelt for a medium-sized dog. I thought that really was perfect for a dog going on a long road trip. And again, just to get your pet more comfortable before you're taking a long drive, do a trial drive with your pet. Take them on an errand, go to the drive-through at Starbucks, go around the block. I think these days we're all looking for some place to drive. What a great idea to put your pet in the car and just take a drive with them, just to get them more comfortable driving in their carrier. Allow them to lay down and be themselves and comfortable in your car. Another note about dogs in the car, we think it's very cute when dogs stick their head out the window, but of course that can lead to some pretty serious injury. They have risk of jumping out of the window. They can get struck by a flying object or debris that can injure their face, their eyes, especially, and their ears. I've seen several injuries come in through the emergency room for this exact thing. I once had a dog during vet school. She lived with me, and when I drove around, she would be in my passenger seat, and I thought it was very cute until one day she saw a squirrel outside and literally jumped out of the window to try to chase the squirrel, and I'll never forget because she really could have really killed herself. And I just, from personal experience, keep the window closed or keep it close enough so that they can't jump out. Just to talk about car safety in general, never leave your pet in a parked car. 31 states have laws against leaving an animal in an unattended vehicle in unsafe conditions. And according to the AVMA, temps inside cars can actually increase 20 degrees Fahrenheit in just 10 minutes and up to 40 degrees Fahrenheit or higher in 60 minutes. So that means like today, it was in New York, it was a very beautiful but cool day out at 70 degrees, but it can actually be 110 degrees in your car, which is very warm. So ideally, your pet should never be left in a car under any conditions, really. So travel safety when it comes to traveling by planes, hopefully so soon. You want to make sure the carrier is TSA approved. Most carriers will actually say on it that it's TSA approved, but if you're unsure, you can, just check on the internet or check with the airline that you're planning on flying. You always, if you have a brachycephalic breed, you always want to use a lot of caution when traveling via plane with them. Brachycephalic breeds are dogs or cats that have very smushed in faces, like English bulldogs, French bulldogs, Pekingese, Persian cats, any animal that has one of those like flat, very adorable faces. Some airlines won't even allow them to fly, or some airlines will only allow them to fly under certain weather conditions. So you definitely want to check with the airline that you're planning to use, because even common airlines like Lufthansa will only allow those brachycephalic dogs to travel if the departure and destination area is less than 80 degrees. So you really make sure to check if you have one of these animals. And over half of dog deaths actually associated with air travel over the past 5 years have been with brachycephalic breeds. So you really want to pay extra special attention to these guys when traveling. And if there's any way to avoid it, you should. If you can, you want to make sure the animal can travel in the cabin. This is pretty easy when it comes to cats and smaller dogs. If your dog is larger and has to go in cargo, I guess I would highly consider boarding your pet or leaving it with a friend rather than taking it with you if you're just going for a trip. Obviously, if you're moving across country, that's different. You have to take them, but for, small trips, I would really err on the side of not taking them, getting them a safe place to stay at home so that they avoid going in cargo. Very important, especially as a veterinarian, you want to make sure you know the requirements of interstate and international travel before you go on your trip, so you can obtain the appropriate CVI, which is the Certificate of Veterinary Inspection. This is so important. I can't tell you how many people come into the emergency room for a non-emergent travel certificate like 48 hours before they go on an international trip. Unfortunately, a lot of emergency vets aren't able to do this. You actually need USDA certification to sign off on international travel. So you have to make sure that your vet is USDA certified before flying internationally. And you can't just show up at your vet expecting them to have everything ready for you in a short period of time. Some animals actually need vaccinations weeks before they travel and documentation weeks before they travel. So it's super important that if you're flying internationally, you must look up where you're going and what needs to be required of that. And also, all of the steps that you need to take in order to get your pet safely there. Just some general considerations with travel. You always want to bring your pet's medical records with you. I think in this age, when we have access to digital records, this should be pretty easy just to have your vet email them to you before you go away. You always want to pack a travel bag for your pet. This includes mostly medications and food and water, some first aid care if you need it, something comfortable for your pet, like their comfort bone or whatever they like. You also, if you think your pet needs sedation, you really do want to talk to your veterinarian about sedation well before you travel. Again, another thing that, takes a little bit of planning, but you could end up in a situation where if you haven't tried it, sedating your pet right before you travel, perhaps that sedation doesn't work well enough and your pet is not at all affected by the sedation. Or perhaps you sedate your pet before you're about to fly and your animal becomes overly sedate. And that is, I think, as a pet owner, scary to see when you're in the middle of, the Atlantic Ocean and your animal seems very sedate, almost too sedate. So if you think your pet's going to need sedation, the best thing to do is do a sedation trial before you are to leave. Just in your house, just give your pet that medication and see how it affects them. And then you can titrate it as needed. You want to feed your pet at least 4 hours prior to traveling. That obviously can decrease GI upset from motion sickness. You don't want to feed them right before they get on a flight or in a car. That could just lead to vomiting as you're driving, which then just takes up, an hour of your time to clean up. Another great thing to do is to exercise your pet prior to travel in a car or on an airplane. Take them for a run in the morning, get them tired so that they really rest in the car. If you're in the airport, run them up and down the terminal. There's nothing wrong with that. Get them going so that when they get in their carrier on the flight, that they can just be resting comfortably. And of course, you always want to make sure your pet has proper identification and that the carrier is very clearly marked that there's a live animal inside and what your home address is, what your destination is, what your flight is, all of those things super important. Can you hear my baby crying? I'm very sorry to everyone. I hope it's not that loud. She's fine.
I can't hear her.
You can't? Okay, good. Holiday food toxicities. This is going to be really the bulk of our presentation. I think something, as an emergency room doctor that we see super commonly, especially over the holidays. These things we see way more than we see on a normal basis. So chocolate is a huge toxicity we see in the animal ER. Mostly dogs are affected just because of their indiscriminate nature. But cats, chocolate is toxic to cats as well, but I think they're just less likely to get into it. Theobromine and caffeine are the toxins in chocolate that make it dangerous. And these toxins are very readily absorbed by the GI tract and widely distributed throughout the body. It's metabolized by the liver and excreted in urine. There's about 3 to 10 times theobromine versus caffeine in chocolate, but really both of them contribute to the clinical signs, which I'll get to on the next slide. And toxicity is typically dose dependent. So the more chocolate that your animal eats, the more likely they are to get sick. But of course, individual sensitivity can come into play, just like with a lot of toxins. So sometimes you'll see an animal, a 10-kilogram dog, eat a bunch of chocolate and never feels one thing wrong with them. They're totally fine. And then other dogs will eat the same amount of chocolate and be the same weight and be more affected. So there are individual sensitivities for sure. And I think what's interesting about chocolate, and it's a good thing to know as a pet owner, is that the amount of theobromine, which is that toxic compound, differs with the type of chocolate that your animal ingests. So here is a great chart that goes over common chocolates that animals could potentially ingest. As you can see, white chocolate really has very insignificant amounts of toxin in it. So when your animal, if by any reason ingests white chocolate, you typically don't need to seek veterinary care unless your animal starts developing gastrointestinal upset just from eating something that they shouldn't. And this, the level of theobromine will increase with different types of chocolate. The most serious, obviously, being this dry cocoa powder, chocolate in its purest form, or the baker's chocolate, anything that's less diluted with milk. Okay, so what do we expect to see when animals ingest chocolate? The signs can really vary. So the mild signs that we typically see are just vomiting, diarrhea, gastrointestinal upset. Sometimes people will notice that their pet is a little bit restless, doesn't really want to settle down. Sometimes you'll notice that they're drinking excessively or maybe urinating excessively. And that can increase to more moderate and severe effects of chocolate ingestion, which as an emergency doctor, we're most concerned about. And that's the tremors that you can see in animals that ingest a large amount of chocolate that can actually even lead to seizures, hypertension, which is high blood pressure, and tachyarrhythmias, which is when their heart rhythm is very, very fast. And those oftentimes need treatment in a veterinary emergency room with medication. So as you can see, it really ranges in what we can see. And a lot of the times, when an animal presents to us, they'll look a certain way, and a couple of hours later, they'll look potentially worse. So even if you think that your animal is just on the mild side of this, it's best to seek veterinary attention because they can progress. Generally, the prognosis is good with treatment, especially if an animal is decontaminated. So if your animal ingested chocolate, please, bring them in sooner rather than later, because if we're able to decontaminate your pet with vomiting or giving them activated charcoal to help bind any residual toxin in it, then they'll have less of those negative and toxic effects potentially. So you always want to seek veterinary care as soon as possible. And if you're unsure, like if your pet may have ingested a small amount of milk chocolate, or, you're not super sure if your animal ate it at all, you can always call us, or you can call the ASPCA Poison Control Center. Here's their number, but it's very easily Googleable, or you can call the AMCER, and we're happy to answer any questions if you think that your animal needs veterinary care, we can tell you. Okay, so Another thing we commonly see through the ER, especially at this time, is turkey, chicken, like skin, bone ingestion. Super common. Obviously, these are fixtures at during the holidays. So just to know, turkey and chicken in general are not toxic to dogs and cats. It's obviously a very big ingredient when it comes to pet food, but ingestion in large quantities can cause GI upset. And especially if your animal ingests a large amount of fat in the form of skin or oil, this could lead to pancreatitis, which is a relatively common condition that we see in dogs and cats, which is basically inflammation of the pancreas. And this is a condition that can have a very wide range of severity. So some animals can have mild cases of pancreatitis, whereas others can have very, very severe cases of pancreatitis and require extended hospitalization. And that really depends on perhaps how much fat that they ingested or how big their fatty meal was, but also sometimes a breed-related sensitivity to pancreatitis. Like Yorkies, for example, are very prone to pancreatitis. Schnauzers are very prone to pancreatitis. And if these animals perhaps eat any of these things, maybe they would be more affected than another animal. So if your animal begins to vomit excessively, become inappetent, all of those things, seems uncomfortable, definitely seek veterinary attention. Here's an interesting thing that I think everyone should know. So if an animal ingests a bone, it's typically not a problem. I can't tell you how many animals come in for chicken bone ingestion to the emergency room, or my dog ate an entire chicken off the table, but he's like wagging his tail and looks actually completely fine. So in most cases, animals are very good at digesting bones. Of course, eating them can lead to GI upset, but again, most animals really are able to dissolve bones very easily, especially chicken bones. They're very thin walled. Animals, especially dogs, their pH of their stomach is very low, lower than a human's, and it actually just really dissolves bones very readily. They're very used to it. And our biggest concern as veterinarians is not that your animal ate a bone and they're totally fine, or maybe having like a little bit vomiting, but our biggest concern is that potentially this bone ingestion can lead to an esophageal obstruction or cause an esophageal foreign body. This is a medical emergency and requires specialized intervention, usually by endoscopy, to remove that bone from their esophagus. And to know the difference at home, you know, if your pet ate a bone and it's wagging its tail, eating, drinking normally, and it's acting normally, you don't need to seek veterinary attention. If your animal ate a bone and they seem uncomfortable, have excessive drooling, begin regurgitating after they eat, won't eat, you know, seem very uncomfortable, can't get comfortable, are sticking their neck out, you know, just like if you were to have something, if you've ever swallowed something that temporarily got caught in your esophagus, it's obviously very uncomfortable. If your animal is acting that way, you absolutely need to seek veterinary attention as soon as possible. The esophagus is a very unforgiving organ, and in order to remove that bone that gets caught there, you really need endoscopy and very specialized intervention. The longer it stays there, the worse prognosis is. So definitely seek veterinary attention immediately if your animal is exhibiting those signs that I just mentioned.
Sorry, I have a quick question about that. Just
Yeah.
with the bones, is it better though to keep the bones away from your dog? You're saying if they accidentally get into it, but don't feed it to them, right? Yeah,
totally good point. Don't feed your dog bones. That's not what I'm saying.
Okay, good.
What I'm saying is that if your dog accidentally ingests them.
Got it. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
No, sorry, I didn't mention that.
That's okay.
You know, I think in New York, for some reason, the streets are just like littered with chicken bones from people eating chicken wings and throwing them on the street. I can't tell you how many dogs eat chicken bones off the street. Like they just find them everywhere. So
totally, yeah.
Yeah, if accidentally, of course, don't feed your dog bones. Terrible.
Okay.
I should have said that. Okay, so here's a good one. I think a lot of people aren't actually aware that these grapes, currants, and raisins are toxic to pets. I think people will learn that after their animal perhaps ingests one, and then they Google it and they're like, oh no, that's bad. I need to come in. So this is a toxicity we mostly see in dogs, but the toxicity is also expected in cats. It just hasn't been definitively proven in cats. I think just because, again, cats are just less likely to eat these things than dogs. The method of toxicity is unknown. So research has been done. No one actually knows what about grapes, currants, raisins it is that causes the toxicity that we see. And the reaction is idiosyncratic. And what that means is that some pets will have reactions while others will not. And you're really unable to predict which animals will be affected and which animals won't. To give you an idea, it's not, death has actually been reported in dogs that ingest only 4 to 5 grapes. So it really depends on the animal itself. So in that case, we really treat even one grape ingestion as an emergency. So if your animal ingests 1 grape, 1 raisin, we're going to tell you the exact same thing than if your animal ingests 10 grapes or 10 raisins. And I can't tell you how many people are like, I've been feeding my dog grapes for years, he's fine. Well, that's great. But at the same time, he's just perhaps one of those animals that's not affected. But there's really no way to know that. So if your animal ingests a grape, raisin, currant, even just one, you really do need to seek veterinary attention. And the reason why it's so dangerous is that it can cause an AKI or an acute kidney injury. And to focus on it, the dose response relationship has not been determined. So we don't know, is it worse if your animal eats more grapes or just a few? We again treat them all very much the same. So the effects that we see usually happen within 48 hours. What people will notice at home typically are gastrointestinal upset like vomiting and diarrhea, inappetence. In the beginning phases of acute kidney injury, people will notice that their animal is drinking more or urinating more than usual. And then that can actually progress to decrease or absent urination later on in the disease. And that obviously is very, very bad. And again, just like chocolate, decontamination is absolutely key. So if your animal ingests a grape, raisin, trail mix with any of these things in it, coming in sooner rather than later so that we can induce vomiting and try to get that toxin out of their body is the best thing to do instead of just waiting to see what happens. We always recommend coming in for that if ingestion is within a couple of hours. Obviously, if your animal ate grapes yesterday, we can't help you with decontamination at that point, but we still will have you come in to check blood work and things like that. There was actually a recent study on this in JVEC, which is a veterinary journal, that showed about 6.7% of known grapes or raisin ingestion causes AKI in dogs. So just to give you an idea of like how common it is for animals to be affected when they ingest grapes or grape or raisins, out of 120 dogs with known ingestion, 8 of them develop kidney changes. So it's not super, super common. It is more likely that your animal will be totally fine. But again, we can't tell you that for sure because your animal may be one of those 8 out of 120 dogs that actually do develop kidney injury. And actually out of those 8 dogs that did develop kidney injury, 1 of them actually died. So although toxicity is uncommon and the risk of death is rare, it is present and we treat everything like it potentially could be very serious. Okay, so I like this one because I think it's sort of interesting and it's not something that we think about very much as pet owners. So we're going to talk about yeast dough ingestion. Of course, bread baking and all of those things are very common over the holidays, but I think this now is even more common because of quarantine. A lot of people are becoming bakers. So why is this so dangerous to your pet? Yeast dough ingestion can not only cause a mechanical obstruction, but it can also cause biochemical changes for your pet. And yeast can replicate in the stomach and cause the dough to expand. So this picture of this dog licking this like little ball of dough, that actually, once it gets into your animal's stomach, can triple in size. And that can actually cause a physical obstruction. If you could imagine that little thing, you wouldn't super worry about it. If it's 3 times the size, 4 times the size, it's concerning. It's going to decrease, prevent emptying of the stomach and can cause an obstruction for sure. And as it starts to rise, it actually releases carbon dioxide and alcohol as byproducts of fermentation. So as that thing starts to get larger, it's releasing gas, and that can actually cause your pet's stomach to expand very, very widely and tautly and uncomfortably. And that can lead to some pretty serious cardiovascular compromise, pain, and they present very similar to dogs that come in with GDVs or gastric dilation and volvulus, which I think a lot of people are familiar with when their animal's stomach like twists on itself. It's very common in larger deep-chested dogs. But this can sort of mimic that with the amount of gas that is formed in their stomach. It doesn't twist, but it just expands and becomes very taut and requires emergency care for sure. So that's one reason why it's no good and very uncomfortable for your pet. But the other reason is the alcohol that is produced during fermentation as well. This alcohol can lead to CNS depression, ataxia, which is incoordination of their gait, falling over, weakness, recumbency, and pretty significant electrolyte disturbances where their blood actually becomes very acidotic, and that requires fluid therapy in order to correct. So what's interesting in like what's the alcohol production is actually the thing that keeps these animals typically in the ICU for a longer period of time, because it can be pretty significant how affected they are from that alcohol production from the fermentation. So in these cases, you know, I've been saying decontamination, but in this case, decontamination can be a little bit more difficult because if your animal ingests yeast dough and they develop neurologic signs like that CNS depression, ataxia, weakness, recumbency, we're not going to be able to allow them to throw up because that can put them at risk for aspiration pneumonia, and it's very unsafe to do that. So if your animal ingests yeast dough and they're still normal, come in as soon as you possibly can, because if you wait, by the time that they develop actual effects of the alcohol, then we're not going to be able to make them vomit, and things become obviously a lot more difficult. And this same principle actually applies to alcohol ingestion. I didn't have a slide here for that, but it's the same as this. So if your animal gets into alcohol during the holidays, not the CO2 production, but the CNS depression and the weakness and the recumbency and all of those things can absolutely happen. And I've seen it many times. People that, you know, they leave alcohol out on their table and their dogs lick it because maybe it's mixed with something sweet, or some people think it's funny to intentionally feed their animal alcohol. Those animals can get very, very, very sick. And I can't stress that enough. But I think I just like yeast dough as an interesting toxin for me. Okay, onions and garlic. I think this is also something that people aren't very familiar with, or, you know, they will Google it after their pet ingests onions and garlic. So onions and garlic are toxic to dogs and cats. Any member of the allium family are actually toxic to pets. And this also includes leeks and shallots, which I guess I wouldn't like think about, but they're also toxic. These toxin ingestions can cause oxidative damage to red blood cells, which leads to hemolysis, which is basically like cell destruction, like the cell just bursts, and can cause an anemia or low red blood cell count. And this is a very dose-dependent toxin. Cats are way more sensitive to this toxin than dogs are. These cats are just sensitive beings. 5 grams per kg ingestion of onions or garlic can cause toxicity in cats. In dogs, it's about 3 to 6 times more than that can cause toxicity. And just to give you an idea, like a 50-pound dog would need to ingest 1 medium to large onion in order to cause toxicity. So that's like a lot of onion, if you think about it, for your animal to actually eat to cause a problem. So I think this is another thing that if your animal gets into a couple of slices of onions, a couple of slices of garlic covered something, you know, likely your animal will be just fine. They really need to ingest greater than 0.5% of their body weight in order to cause a problem. If your animal ingests a couple of slices of onion, just give us a call. You don't need to 100% rush into the emergency room. If you want to, you absolutely can. But in most cases, we may, you know, make your pet vomit just to be safe or send you home, because it takes a lot of these toxins to actually cause a problem in animals. And in general, garlic is less toxic than onion. But I've had so many animals come in because they eat slices of onion off a sandwich, and typically we actually don't do anything or worry about them too much. And the prognosis with true toxicity is very good with treatment, but in some cases it can be serious depending, again, on how much they eat. And if their animal does eat a large amount, then obviously bringing them in for decontamination to induce vomiting is very important. Okay, so we just finished our food portion, and now we're going to move on to decor dangers. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to touch on, which is pretty common, especially during the holidays, are light strings or electrical cord electrocution. This is something that most commonly affects young animals, although all ages are at risk. I think honestly the most common animal that's affected is a puppy, but cats are very, very attracted to string in general or lights. So they, we also see it with cats, but I would say young puppies are our number one culprits when it comes to electrocution. Clinical signs can vary very much. They can be very mild or they can be very, very severe. On the more mild side, if your animal just bites on for a second and realizes there's something wrong, or if you're able to catch them afterwards, immediately afterwards, you know, what we're likely expecting is just an oral burn. So that top picture there is a cat with an oral burn on the left side of her mouth, and like the back of her tongue, you can see that little darker gray area. That's a little bit of necrotic tissue from biting an electrical cord there. And I would consider this case fairly mild, although as you can imagine, for this cat, it is very uncomfortable and still requires care and treatment. So that's the mild end of the spectrum, and it can actually become pretty severe as far as oral birds are concerned. Some animals will have a lot of necrotic tissue. Their entire tongue and mouth can be affected. Some animals even require feeding tube placement to bypass their oral cavity. And then if those animals that have such severe burns, we typically also see with it something called pulmonary edema or fluid in the lungs, which can be caused by the electrocution as well. And this can immediately lead to difficulty breathing, as well as cardiac arrhythmia secondary to the electrocution, as just like in people. So this bottom picture is of radiographs of a dog's chest who bit an electrical cord, and they came in with a very increased respiratory rate and effort. And you can see that their lungs, which I have a pointer here, but is supposed to be very dark and black, or is more white, and that's actually the fluid from the electrocution, and it can be very, 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 very serious. So the prognosis with these cases, it really varies depending on how severe the animal is affected. But I can tell you, even pretty severe animals with proper care can do okay and can make a full recovery. So if your animal bites an electrical cord, no matter how mild or severe you think it is, you absolutely need to seek veterinary care immediately. I would recommend going to an actual emergency veterinarian rather than your local veterinarian, honestly, because these can be very, very serious. Some animals require a very intensive hospitalization, oxygen therapy, feeding tube placement, like I mentioned before, and even mechanical ventilation. So it's a pretty serious decor danger for sure. Okay, another quite serious danger when it comes to holiday time is ornament and tinsel ingestion. So, you know, ornaments, just like any foreign body, can obviously cause GI upset if ingested. They can cause a foreign body obstruction, and then also just the glass, a lot of them are glass or plastic, and if chewed can cause injury or lacerations to the mouth or oral cavity or to the esophagus, leading to really bad esophagitis. So, you know, be very wary of your animals around these things. Don't give it to them to be cute or take a picture or whatever. It can actually lead to some pretty serious things. More serious to me as an emergency veterinarian is actually tinsel. And it's particularly dangerous due to its linear nature. Cats are typically more affected than dogs, but both species are at risk. And tinsel ingestion can lead to linear foreign body obstruction. And that's what we're always concerned about when it comes to like string or tinsel or anything that, you know, has that linear nature. Linear foreign bodies in general typically carry a worse prognosis than nonlinear foreign bodies, like an actual, like, you know, single object, like an ornament would be perhaps less concerning than if your animal ate a whole big thing of string or tinsel. And the reason for that is that one end of the string or tinsel actually becomes typically lodged in two places that we see. The first one being under your animal's tongue, and this is especially apparent in cats. This picture to the right here is a cat with a linear foreign body that's lodged right at the base of its tongue. That's why we always try as best as we possibly can to check under your cat's tongue when they're vomiting, because sometimes we will actually see this. Looks like it's just sewing thread, which is another really common cause of this problem, but it gets anchored right at the base of the tongue, and then the rest of the string goes down their esophagus, through their stomach, and through their pylorus, which is where the stomach empties into the small intestines, and the small intestines start to move just like they normally do with normal peristalsis. And it takes that anchor at the tongue, or actually at the pylorus is another place where it can anchor. And it just, as the intestines move, it sort of acts, the string acts like a saw. And as the intestines move, it like uses that string to really saw through the wall of the intestines, and can lead to sepsis, which is a widespread abdominal infection with these guys. And it can lead to surgery where they're not just making one incision into the intestines, but multiple. And these unfortunately can carry a worse prognosis. So if you think that your animal ate string, or you're worried that they did, it's always better to seek veterinary care sooner rather than later, of course. And I think if you have, honestly, if you have a cat, I would just put all tinsel away during the holiday time. I just wouldn't even have it in my house, because the risk is it's too scary to me. Okay, so just to touch on just Christmas tree related injuries. Obviously, unsecured trees can fall and cause traumatic injury to pets. Cats are very curious. They'll jump on the trees. People think it's funny, but they can actually become, get serious traumatic injury secondary to that. And then animals that eat branches can cause, at the very least, gastrointestinal upset, but it can actually lead to foreign body obstruction. One Christmas, I always work Christmas, and for the past 11 years, and a dog came in vomiting up pine needles. On his radiographs, he had a mechanical obstruction. We went to surgery with him, and I'm not exaggerating to you. An entire Christmas tree came out of his abdomen. It was insane, just like branches of Christmas trees, of the Christmas tree. It was nuts. He ate like all of it. So I've seen it. It can be very, very serious. Ingestion of tree water can also, I think at the very least, just cause gastrointestinal upset. It's stagnant plant material water. Our animals aren't that discerning sometimes when it comes to that. So dogs and cats can drink out of that dish often. Some people will even use aspirin as a common additive to help preserve tree health and longevity during this time. And if there's aspirin in your water, then the cat or dog who ingests it can again cause GI upset, even GI ulceration, and in very large quantities can cause an acute kidney injury, or AKI, similar to the grape ingestion that we talked about before. And cats are more sensitive to NSAID toxicity, NSAID ingestion like aspirin than dogs are, but both are affected. So in order to prevent this, just make sure you have one of those tree water dishes that's covered. They sell them. It seems like an easy thing to just institute and avoid this problem. Okay, to touch on some Jewish decor dangers, just some Hanukkah menorah and dreidels potentially. It's potentially an open flame in your apartment, and cats and dogs can be very, very curious. Cats, can jump onto your dining room table and, knock a menorah over. Dogs can wag their tail if you have it in a low, or even jump up and knock it over. So, you always want to be very, very, very careful when lighting candles for Hanukkah around your pets. If you can keep them out of reach, obviously that's the best thing to do, or obviously never leave a candle unattended, be around, the couple hours that it takes for them to go out. And if you really want to be super safe, you can use those flameless candles instead, or the ones with the lights. Dreidels can, of course, be interesting to your animal because they spin and they look like dog toys or cat toys even. So they can, of course, cause a choking hazard or an obstruction if your animal ingests them. So just be very careful and just keep in mind of the dreidels when you're playing with them, for sure. So I'm going to talk about some common holiday flowers and plants that we see. There are many, many potentially toxic plants and flowers to our pets. And of course, I think the best thing to do before bringing one of these plants into your house is to just Google it and to see if it's safe for your animal. There are so many websites that actually tell you if your plant or flower is safe to have in your house for animals. It's actually sort of amazing. So, you can also ask the store owner or whatever. They should probably know that, but just check the internet and see if, before you even bring something into your house, if it's okay. I think poinsettias is actually a lot of people know that poinsettias are potentially toxic to animals around the holidays. And I've seen every Christmas season, holiday season, someone will come in from their animal ingesting a poinsettia. And what's interesting about this is that, yes, they are potentially toxic to your animal. They have a very irritating sap, which can cause irritation to the mouth and the GI lining and can lead to vomiting and diarrhea. But generally, they're not like very toxic. It's not like your animal is ingesting something that can potentially cause them very great harm or systemic illness other than GI upset. And there's really no need to seek veterinary care unless your animal is exhibiting gastrointestinal signs. So if your animal ingested a poinsettia and they're fine, you don't need to come in. You just need to keep an eye on them and make sure that their vomiting or diarrhea is not excessive. And if that's the case, then obviously do come in, but you don't need to like rush in. On the other other side of the spectrum where you actually would need to rush in is if your cat was to ingest lilies. And I think, again, this is also something some people know, but not everyone knows. And I think it really should be more widely known because lilies are extremely, extremely, extremely toxic to cats, not at all to dogs. It's not a problem for dogs. Cats, again, are just like sensitive beings. And for whatever reason, they are very, very sensitive to lilies. And what happens, again, is that it can cause an AKI or an acute kidney injury and even death, even in small amounts. And this really applies to all parts of the lily. So the leaf, the stem, the flower, the pollen, anything like that. Even if your cat doesn't actually ingest part of the lily, but gets pollen on his paws or on his face and licks it up, that is still an emergency. And you absolutely need to come in and seek veterinary attention immediately. This is not something you want to like mess around with and see. You want to come in as soon as possible. And we see this, unfortunately, very, very often, more so around the holidays times, also during Easter and things like that, where lilies are common gifts. But really, if you have a cat, you should never, ever, ever, ever have a lily in your house. And there's many, many different lily varieties. There's like 100 of them. Just avoid them all because it's hard to figure out sometimes what type of lily it is. Just assume that they're all bad for you, for your cat. Just briefly to touch on other holiday plants, mistletoe and holly, common holiday plants, those can also cause GI upset in pets if ingested, similar to poinsettia. If ingested in very large quantities, they can cause hypersalivation, and in very rare instances, low blood pressure and a low heart rate. So if your animal eats like a lot of that, then perhaps seek veterinary attention. If your animal eats a small amount and is otherwise doing fine, again, you don't need to come in. Okay, so we're just briefly touch on party faux pas. Get it? Okay, some tips. So, you want to make sure all the doors, windows, and gates remain closed. And this really applies to if you're having people over to your house, but also if you're going to someone's house with a pet, you want to be very mindful of this. I think now we're all spending a lot of time outside. If you're going to a party that's outside, going back and forth within the kitchen or opening that door can lead to pets getting out inadvertently and getting lost or getting hit by a car. And then, of course, with windows, especially in New York, we're having an unseasonably warm time here in New York. A lot of people are opening their windows. Cats get curious and fall out of windows all the time. I literally see it every single day. It's more commonly seen during warm times or like these warm, events that were happening in November, but this is the time everyone's opening their window and the cat's like about to, fall out of the window. We literally see it all the time. So just be very mindful of that. If you're in someone's apartment, ask if you can open the window before doing it. Make sure there are screens, make sure there's window guards, something, so that you don't just open it and leave it and then the cat is missing. It's a very common story, unfortunately. Of course, you want to speak to all guests that you're having over about feeding your pet table scraps and especially toxic foods. People think that they're being kind to your animal by giving them things, and that can obviously lead to really significant gastrointestinal upset and even a trip to the emergency room. So please talk to your family members, your friends, your guests about just don't feed your animal anything. Just they'll forgive you. Like the animal still loves you. That's the thing about animals. You always want to make sure all pets have proper identification. I think people forget, especially with their cats, that if perhaps they were to get out, a lot of them won't be wearing actually identification on their collars. It's great when our pets are microchipped. That's definitely an amazing, amazing thing that all pets should be microchipped, cats, dogs, whoever. But not everyone, of course, has a microchip scanner ready. So if someone in your neighborhood finds your pet, it's best that they have a readable form of identification rather than having to take that pet to the shelter or to a veterinarian in order to be scanned to find out if there's a microchip. So if you're having people over, remember to put on some obvious form of identification, and don't forget about your cat. You always want to make sure your pet has a safe space to retreat to. I think people think their animals are social, but sometimes it's just overwhelming to them to have that many people over. So, you know, they're great if that's something that they love. A room. If your cat loves your closet, make sure the closet door is open. Something that where they can just go to if they're feeling overwhelmed with the amount of people, and feel more comfortable and have some private space. You obviously don't want to leave food on low surfaces. You know, that can be swiped up very easily by a dog, especially. And of course, you always want to clear trash immediately. And I know that sounds like something everyone's like, oh, of course I would do that. But I can't tell you how many people will just leave their trash overnight to be cleared the next morning. And that's when your animal gets into it. It's overnight. So just take that extra step and just bring that stuff outside or put it in a trash can so that your animal can't get into it. But those bags that are left open in the kitchen or left, you know, unsecured in the kitchen is when animals get into things. And then of course, always make sure if you're going to someone's house, you know, don't bring your pet without asking, because sometimes animals can, you know, not get along, or, you know, it can, maybe there's a guest that's planning on coming that has allergies or doesn't like animals. So you always just want to make sure to ask the host if you're able to bring your pet along with you, and don't bring it without any notice. Okay. Yay. Okay. So does anyone have any questions related to anything we went over today or unrelated?
We have a few questions. So let's go back to the, I know you mentioned with tinsel. So you have a question, is it unsafe to play with string or shoelaces with your cat?
Yeah, you know, we don't want to deprive cats of their fun, because I think they love string and shoelaces, and there's so many toys on the market with like a feather on a string and all that stuff. I think the biggest thing is to put it, just when you're done playing, make sure to put it away. Don't leave it with them to play alone. And because I can't also tell you how many people have like a shoelace or some sort of, you know, fun string toy, and they're playing with their cat, and then they like go do something in another room, they come back and it's gone. And then they're like, I don't know what happened. Maybe my cat ate it. Maybe he just like put it over there. And then we're going to spend like a lot of money trying to figure out and putting your cat through perhaps diagnostics that they don't even need to try to figure out if that string is actually in their body or if it's just somewhere else in your apartment. So I think really it's about not leaving them alone with these things, but you can play with them as long as it's supervised.
And then just actually back to the Christmas tree, the Christmas tree stand with the water.
Yeah.
Is it always poisonous, or is it just if there's aspirin, or just, I guess you don't know what's in it?
That it's poison. It's for sure toxic if there is aspirin. I mean, honestly, the aspirin is pretty diluted. The animal would have to drink like all of the water or multiple times throughout the day, but that totally sometimes happens, or you're not aware that your animal is doing that. That's really what's toxic about it. Stagnant plant water, though, can, if ingested, can just cause gastrointestinal upset and can make your pet pretty sick, but not toxic, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes. And then we also have a couple of comments, which I think are good, that they're saying that they don't trust window screens, you know, that it could be weak screens. So even if
that's true.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, I know we see a lot of that, right, at AMC, the high-rise syndrome.
Right?
Yeah.
Like literally every day. I mean, I saw it like yesterday.
It's crazy how they can survive. Obviously, you don't want to test
that. It is actually, I mean, with intensive veterinary care, it's not
amazing work that you guys do.
Yeah. Like with people, I mean, we see it all the time. Obviously, we're very used to treating these cases, but with care, the animals typically can recover. But of course, that's sometimes with multiple surgical procedures, you know, so much time, thousands and thousands of dollars. And of course, you know, no one wants to go through that. So although it's possible, sometimes it's just not feasible for a lot of people. So it's obviously better to just prevent that from happening.
Great. Yes. And then if someone is traveling, they were asking about finding a local vet hospital, so which is good to know, I guess,
totally
ahead of time.
Major point. that's a great tip for sure, is to know where you're traveling and where the nearest ER veterinarian is for sure. That is something that is everyone should take into account 100%, because sometimes if you're traveling, you know, to more rural places, the nearest emergency vet can be hours away. So it's very important to know that for sure.
Good, good. Any other questions? I think we've covered most of them, but you covered so many great topics. So thank you again for that. And everyone, thank you for joining us. I know it's a difficult time, weird time, but we, really appreciate you spending the time with us, and we wish you all very, very happy holidays, and a safe one as well. So thank you, everybody. And thank you, Dr. Fox. Thank you, Kimberly.
Bye.
Thank you all. Okay.